Welcome to the Launch Capsule. With your host, James DuBos. Buckle up because your launch capsule begins now.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey there, Jim DuBos here, and thanks for joining me on this episode of the Launch Capsule. Today's episode, we're going to continue discussing the elements of the definitive purchase agreement. So in element 6, or area 6, is what I will refer to as the covenants section. And they're just the ongoing commitments, either affirmative, the things the party agrees to, or negative, things the party agree not to do, that maintain the integrity of the business between signing and closing. They also sometimes will contain post-closing obligations, such as transition support or non-compete issues, those types of things. So it's basically operate in the ordinary course of business until closing, maintain existing relationships with customers and vendors, no new material contracts, debts, or asset sales, agree to exclusivity, no negotiations with other buyers. You're going to provide access for buyer due diligence through this journey. The seller agrees to non-solicitation and non-compete for a period, and the buyer and seller both agree to post-closing cooperation. Very common covenants in this section. Section 7 is the conditions to closing, and it's specific to the conditions that have to be met before the transaction can close. It helps to protect both parties, ensures no unexpected or adverse changes occur before the deal is finalized, and it's an opportunity for people to walk away or renegotiate. So an example of buyer conditions, that all the reps and warranties of the seller are accurate, no material adverse change has occurred, the due diligence is satisfactorily completed, the closing documents are executed and delivered, and the required consents and approvals are obtained. The seller conditions, purchase price has been funded and delivered, buyer's reps and warranties are true, buyer's board and investor approvals are received, any ancillary agreements are signed, things like consulting agreements, non-compete, and so forth. Those are very common in this section. Section 8 is indemnification. It's just allocates risk after closing, how losses due to breach or misrepresentation, any undisclosed liabilities are to be handled and compensated. It also establishes any liability caps, timeframes, and any claim procedures. So some examples would be things like who indemnifies whom and for what is the period of the reps and warranties, 12 months, 24 months, etc. What is the indemnity cap? 10%, 20% of the purchase price. Any baskets, I'll call it minimum claim threshold before indemnity applies. Carve out for fraud, intentional misrepresentation that's not subject to a cap. And then any third-party claims process, defense, cooperation, settlements, and so forth. And Section 9 is termination. It allows the agreement to be canceled under certain conditions, such as failure to meet the closing date, a breach of terms. It also governs the consequences of termination, including any breakup fees or recovery from confidential information. You could have something defined as termination by mutual agreement, termination due to failed conditions or breach, a drop-dead date termination if the closing doesn't happen by a certain date. What are the consequences? The return of documents, the confidentiality survival, legal remedies. That's all pretty common in a termination section. And Section 10 would be what I refer to as the miscellaneous provisions, and it goes back to supporting the enforceability and the execution of the agreement. A lot of this might seem boilerplate, but it is critical in managing dispute resolution, the jurisdiction, and the document integrity itself. So governing law and jurisdiction, the entire agreement clause, it supersedes all prior understanding. Notices, procedures, email, certified mail, etc. No waiver unless in writing, no assignment without consent, the severability of invalid provisions, and then finally the counterparts and e-signatures. All of that is common within that section. And then lastly, what I would refer to generally is the schedules and exhibits. And these are the attachments that provide detailed lists, supporting documentation, and they're going to be incorporated into the DPA as a reference in the document. And they allow the main document to remain clean, if you will, while capturing the critical transaction details. So Schedule A might be the assets to be acquired. Schedule B might be the excluded assets. Schedule C, assumed liabilities. Schedule D, the employee and contractor list. Schedule E, material contracts. Schedule F might be an intellectual property. You may have another schedule for an escrow agreement, which I'm going to come back to again, and we'll talk about escrow and cash for just a second. Exhibit non-compete agreement. You might have a bill of sale. And then finally, you may have a promissory note if that is applicable. I want to go back to cash for just a second. So in this particular transaction, we're using a $30 million transaction price in the business itself. The question of cash, and I'll say waterfall, if you will, of that cash, how does that generally work? In one of the previous transactions that I did, we basically did a working capital cash flow analysis in the business. And we came to an agreement with the buyer that anything above the working capital threshold was ours to keep. And so the ability for us to generate cash in the final stages of the business while keeping cash in the business so that the business itself could continue to operate, we were able to execute against that. And so we had an opportunity to distribute some capital out of the business prior to the sale based upon that working capital calculation. So it's very important. Like I had said in a previous episode, escrow is very common as long as it is materially time-bound and the conditions are very clear so that you know that when you've executed against the condition within the time frame specified, that escrowed capital will waterfall through the process. It's very common in these transactions to have the waterfall pay any seller legal bills directly from the waterfall of the funds. So in effect, the attorneys get paid as part of that flow of capital. It's very common for your M&A advisory team to be paid through that waterfall of capital, so they're not dependent upon the owners to write separate checks post-sale to them, that it flows straight to them, whatever the cost basis was. And if there's any current liabilities that need to be paid based upon the agreement itself, all of that would be executed. What's generally not retained in the waterfall is any, I'll say, individual taxes. So as monies flow in based upon the organizational structure of the business, you may have certain capital that you retain for a tax liability associated with the entity itself. And then again, as it waterfalls to the individual ownership within the business itself, then you're going to have your personal taxation, which is going to be outside of any of the cash that's waterfalled out to the individual owners. Meaning basically when the tax man or the tax bill comes, you're going to be individually responsible for the payment of taxes, not the corporation. Look, I hope this two-part series was helpful to you to understand the basic construct of a DPA. They tend to be very long documents. The last set of documents that we produced, it was over 130 pages in terms of the document itself, which is why it's important to take it in bite-sized chunks of time, focusing on one part of the document as a whole, because typically what will happen is you'll have the buyer and seller legal teams dialoguing first. They'll produce the document, and then you'll in turn be meeting with your legal team, reviewing certain sections of the document to try to get that behind you and say, okay, I've agreed to that. I'm done with the edits. Let's move on to the next section. So again, a very common process, but it can be very tedious amongst all the other things that you're going to be doing, such as due diligence and other areas, reps and warranties, and so forth. So it is time consuming. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I look forward to continuing this journey together. Have an awesome day.
That's a wrap for today's episode of The Launch Capsule. With your host and mentor to success, James DuBos. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and share.